5.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome all the members to our first meeting of our Economy Committee and advise anyone who wishes to use a mobile device, they can do so as long as it's in airplane mode and the device is muted. You can connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi and all of the details are in the gallery rules, and it's not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting. So if we move on then to the next item on the agenda, it's apologies. And we have received long-term apologies from Stuart Dixon, and most members will be aware that Stuart has been unwell, and we would like to send our well wishes to him.
Chair, if members are content, we'll enter that into the minutes.
Great.
So moving on then to the next item, there is a document of the membership of the committee at page 3 of the table papers for members' information. And then we're moving on to declaration of members' interests. Members are required to register financial and other interests in the register of members' interests, and details of those are published on the Assembly website. And just to remind members, in addition to this requirement, Standard Order 69.5 states that a member who has a financial interest or other relevant interest in any matter must declare that interest before taking part in any proceedings of the Assembly relating to that matter. In particular, there is a requirement to declare any interest which might reasonably be thought by others to influence the member's approach to that matter under consideration. Members can find proceedings of the Assembly includes meetings of this committee.
Yes.
This is the first meeting of the committee, so members should ensure any financial or other interests which relate to the remit of the committee or which are likely to be relevant to a substantial part of its work are drawn to the attention of the committee. It should be noted that failure to register and or declare an interest may be an offence under the section 43 of the Northern Ireland Act 1998. So does any member wish to declare an interest?
No.
And the rules governing registration and declaration of interest are contained in the Code of Conduct and guide to the rules relating to the conduct of members, and further advice can be sought from the Clerk of Standards. Okay, so moving on then to committee procedures. In closed session we discussed a number of items, and the Clerk is just going to detail some of the agreements that we came to.
Chair, thank you. Just to put onto the record, while members were in closed session, the committee agreed to write to all the arm's length bodies of the department to indicate that the committee is meeting again when the committee is meeting, and to seek their input on their priorities and the issues they wish to raise with the committee. Additionally, the committee has agreed to begin to consider a list of other stakeholders that they will write to in the same manner. Chair, also, if I could say, members have agreed in principle that correspondence between the committee and the Minister and vice versa will be published. Obviously there will have to be exceptions to that in some cases, and the same will apply to correspondence with the Permanent Secretary, again with the same caveat. We will publish those on our media platforms as and when they are available to us. Chair, if we also have members' agreement to write to the Minister and Permanent Secretary to set that down in a letter. Okay, then we will do that as well. The other issue, just to outline, members, is that the committee agreed that where it felt it was desirable or necessary, they would meet to undertake a pre-committee briefing session on any particular issue that might require their attention. So I just wanted to get those on record and read them at the minutes, Chair.
Thank you. So the guidance papers for item 12 on committee procedures are page 25, or sorry, page 27 of your pack. And just to point out a couple of those, a guide to the powers and operation of the statutory committee for chairpersons and members are at page 28, a guide to the role of the chairperson at page 39, and a guide for members on the role and functions of the committee office at page 46.
Chair, any questions members might have on that, we're happy to have them referred back to us. But that's really for members to take away and consider at their leisure.
And we also want to draw members' attention in particular to the guidance on privilege and sub judice. Under Section 50 of the 98 Act, for the purposes of the law of defamation, absolute privilege applies equally to making a statement in proceedings of the Assembly and the publication of a statement under the Assembly's authority. This privilege also extends to meetings of the committee. Members should note, however, that privilege does not extend to press conferences or statements to the press. Committee members should be aware of the potential problems associated with discussing a matter that is sub judice, that is, a matter which is being or is about to be considered by a court. The sub judice rule required by Section 41 and Schedule 6 of the 98 Act is contained in Standing Order 73. It provides that any matters in respect of which legal proceedings are active should not be referred to in committee proceedings, except to the extent permitted by the committee chairperson. In such cases, the matter awaiting adjudication should not be prejudiced by comment in public session of a committee meeting. The rules relating to this are summarised in the Guide to the Powers and Operation of Statutory Committees for Chairpersons and Members that members have been provided with at page 28. So, are there any questions or anything that is needed clarified in regards to that?
If anything, Chair, comes up, if members want to refer that back to us, we're more than happy to deal with it.
Okay, then moving on to item 13, guidance and timescales for interaction between committees and departments. We note guidance paper at page 49, which sets out the timescales for provision of information and evidence between departments and committees, and was agreed by the Executive and Assembly Chairpersons Liaison Group.
Again, Chair, that's there for members to consider. We have a particular number of working days in which we expect response to our correspondence.
Okay. So we're moving on then to item 14, which is subordinate legislation, delegation of technical scrutiny to the examiner of statutory rules. And the guidance for this is on page 54 of the pack on handling subordinate legislation. A paper has also been provided at page 5 of the table papers, providing an overview of the types of secondary legislation. If the clerk wouldn't mind briefing the committee regarding consideration of the subordinate legislation.
Chair, members are probably aware from the committees that have already met that during the hiatus there were still statutory rules being laid in the Assembly that were either subject to negative resolution or subject to no procedure. If I can just refresh members and those in the public gallery, negative resolution simply means that the secondary legislation comes into effect at a particular date unless the Assembly chooses to pray against it or annul it. So those have been racking up, if you like. There are several hundred of them. We have around 30. And it'll basically be part of the committee meeting today that we start to go through those. What the little presentation that members have in hard copy does is also identifies the other kinds of secondary legislation, such as confirmative, affirmative, draft, and so on. I'm not going to go through that again now because I'm sure members will be happy to take that away and look at it. But if we just highlight that all of the statutory rules we'll be looking at today and next week are either subject to negative resolution or subject to no procedure. In the case of the no procedure, what we've done is we are reading it into the record for members' approval in the same way as we would negative resolution, rather than simply noting it. That way, members have a record of whether or not they have actually approved the statutory rules with no overall procedure. So just to flag that up, and that's why when we get to that stage of the meeting, it will be relatively time-consuming.
Okay, so there's a motion here that we want to read into the record that the Committee for the Economy, under Standing Order 43, resolves to delegate to the Examiner of Statutory Rules the technical scrutiny of statutory rules referred to the Committee under the above-mentioned Standing Order. The Committee further resolves that in carrying out this function, the Examiner shall be authorised to report her technical findings on each statutory rule to the Assembly and to the relevant department, as well as to the Committee itself, and to publish her report. So our members agreed with that?
Right. Chair, what I'd just say as well is now that we have given, the Committee, has given approval for the Examiner to look at those statutory rules that have come to this committee, the report should issue in the next couple of weeks. Therefore, all of the statutory rules that members are looking at today, if they agree them, that agreement is subject to that report. Members will also be aware, with negative resolution statutory rules, that once they come into effect, there's a number of plenary days while they could still be annulled. We still have the countdown on all of our statutory rules, some more than others. I think the average is probably around 4 plenaries left. So that basically means that while we are under some time pressure, we are not under an absolute time pressure. So if members wish to defer a decision in any of these SRs, we will do that till next week. And if members want to seek further information, again, we can do that as well if members wish to defer a particular SR. So we'll come to that later on once we've had the briefing.
Okay, so we're moving on then to item 15, and the clerk is going to brief us on the report from the committee during 2016-17 mandate.
Chair, this is, I'm just going to deal with this very briefly. What members have in their packs is the end of mandate reports from the ETI and Employment and Learning Committees. Now, obviously those date back to 2016, but a lot of the issues are still relevant. And what I've also added to that is a little bit of an update on what the committee undertook in 2016-17. Now, again, I would ask members to have a look through that at their leisure. But one thing I would seek members' approval to do is write to the department for an update on the issues listed by both the Employment and Learning and the ETI committees in terms of getting here's where we are 4 years along. If members are content, we proceed to do that.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so then we're moving on to item 16, which is our departmental briefing. There is a clerk's memo in relation to this on page 110, and the department's first day brief for the committee at page 112 of the pack, which sets out background information on the remit, structure and functions of the department and identifies the key issues it's facing. A document has been provided in hard copy outlining the main responsibilities and key personnel within the department. So I'd just like to pass on the apologies of the Permanent Secretary, Mr Mike Brennan, who's at a ministerial away day, and I'd like to welcome to our meeting Mr Richard Rogers, Head of Energy, Mr Paul Grockett, EU Exit Preparation and Transition, and Mr Colin Lewis, Management Services and Regulation Group. So if you guys would like to make your statement.
Don't mind, I'll just give a wee, in Mike's absence, just a little introductory brief. He obviously would have liked to be here this morning, but he's accompanying the Minister on executive business. So we were very conscious that you wouldn't be, members may not be fully familiar with the work that we do, so we thought it was just best to continue to allow at least 3 of the 5 secretaries to give you an overview as to what they do. Okay. So I'll just give a wee brief introductory remark, and then I'll pass to my colleagues. What's the time we have available this morning?
We're probably aiming to have completed this by about 12, so you've got plenty of time.
Right, okay. Well, I think we'll probably be spending about 5, maximum 10 minutes on each of our groups, and then allow members to have questions as best we can, okay? So as I said, it's a very broad department, big department, wide remit, and it's divided into 5 groups. I'm responsible for the Management Service and Regulation Group, and I'm accompanied today by Paul Grockett, who heads up our Brexit Preparation and Transition Group, and Richard Rogers, who's responsible for the department's energy group. I understand that the other 2 heads of groups are attending next week. That's Heather Cousins, who's responsible for skills and education, and Dermot McLean, who's responsible for economic strategy. We'll cover a number of issues today within our groups, but we'll probably touch on issues around our budget, employment and business issues, Brexit, and then all issues energy as well. Okay. Should you want to raise anything or have any more specific issues that we may not be able to give you a definitive answer today, happy to bring them to relevant officials in due course. Okay.
Thank you.
I understand that you may well have got a copy of our draft annual business plan.
Yes.
And the progress update. Okay. That will just give you an indication as to the breadth of the business that we're dealing with. And literally it covers everything from salt mines to skills, so it's a wide department. This department was established in 2016 following the merger of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Investment and Department of Employment and Learning. And it brought together all aspects of those departments, minus the Employment Service, which transferred into the Department for the Communities. We have just over 1,000 staff and an annual budget just below £1 billion. That's an inclusive of EU match funding. So it's not an insubstantive amount of money that we have to spend. You'll want to know that this department has gone through a major restructuring exercise over the last 18 months, undertaken to provide greater internal synergies and a more focused approach to our external customer engagement. And as I'll explain later, necessary in light of findings arising from the RHI and Kawari as well. When it comes to budgets and the delivery of our objectives, you'll wish to note that our economic activity and budget relates to the work of almost 20 arm's-length bodies, so we do a lot of delivery through arm's-length bodies. We also have responsibility, of course, for a number of South bodies, those being Tourism Ireland and Interstate Ireland. So I don't propose to go into more detail in terms of introduction. I'll now pass to my colleagues and I'll ask Paul to take through the Brexit work that he's engaged in. Okay?
Okay, thanks, Colin, and thank you very much for the welcome, Chair. I think this is a very important area, so just from my group in particular, I think the scrutiny and the challenge function from the committee is particularly welcome. It's also a highly complex area, so the suggestions that we've provided to the clerk in the first instance, we're happy to come and give you some presentations on background and information, and it'd be my expectation that those will get into much more detail and we can have a conversation about the substance of the issues. Today I was going to concentrate on just giving you an update on what we've been doing over the past 3 years, and then a brief assessment of where we are and how that work is going to progress, particularly over the next 12 months, which are going to be important for Northern Ireland and the Brexit piece. So you'll be aware that we've been particularly active in this space. Our focus has been on providing technical and factual information to decision makers to make sure that they understood the unique circumstances of this place as they're approaching their decisions. And also our arm's bodies have been particularly active, that the number that Colin mentioned there, in sort of ensuring that their clients and their members are best prepared as possible. Transparency has been very important to us in this period, so we've published all of our research and analysis. That has broadly fitted into 3 categories. We've done work on migration and the labour markets, people movement and the common travel area, and then trade and investment. This totals to around 40 pieces of information, which is available on our website. Increasingly, as we went through the period, the focus was on trade and investment, and we responded to decisions that were being taken in Whitehall. Business engagement has also been a key feature of what we've been doing. We have a particularly strong and trusting relationship with the business community. The main vehicle for that relationship being developed and nurtured has been a DFE stakeholder group, where we use that as an opportunity to bring members of the business community in to explain as best we could our understanding of where the negotiations were, and also to collectively agree what the next steps might be and how we might ensure that decision makers understood, as I mentioned, the unique circumstances of this place. The next key area to talk about, I think, is the preparations for no deal. Due to the nature of the negotiations, in which we were facing deadlines in March, April and October, that consumed a large amount of our time. 3 broad areas to mention are Operation Yellowhammer, the legislative exercise that we went through, and also business preparedness as we approach those deadlines. So Operation Yellowhammer was the UK government coordination exercise to ensure that as far as possible the UK in its entirety was prepared for no deal. Our role as a department in that is that we took ownership of energy, telecoms and critical industry, which specifically related to chemicals. That Operation Yellowhammer was formally stood down in December due to the nature of the negotiations and the parliamentary arithmetic in Whitehall. Moving on to legislation, there was a large exercise to assess the extent to which the statute book needed to be updated as a result of EU exit. So in the eventuality that no deal happened, that the legislation was functional. The scoping exercise identified 77 pieces of legislation. They were moved into 36 statutory instruments, SIs, that were progressed through Parliament, that were ready in case the UK left without a deal. And then finally into this no deal preparations, was the extent to which businesses were ready for the eventuality of a no deal happening. Our arm's length bodies were critical here. So Invest and I launched a Brexit assessment tool to allow businesses to assess their risks and their exposure. They also had a number of roadshows throughout Northern Ireland to engage businesses to get them thinking about it. Intertrade also played an important role. They had a planning voucher to encourage businesses to go out and get expert advice so they could understand their issues and take business level decisions to mitigate any potential impacts. And then as a department, we recognised that no deal would have a profound and lasting impact on the Northern Ireland economy and society, so we did our own policy work in developing what an economic policy response would look like. Due to the nature of the negotiations and the progression of the withdrawal agreement bill, none of that work was required, thankfully. Which brings us to the current position. You will have, I'm sure, followed the withdrawal agreement bill through Parliament. There were a small number of amendments accepted by the Lords. That's gone into sort of consideration by the Commons. I think I saw that number 10's intention was to not accept any of them amendments. So there'll be what I expect to be a relatively short period of ping-pong between the two houses. As expected, the withdrawal agreement is passed, that will complete the Article 50 process and the UK will leave the EU on the 31st of January. This will bring into force the Northern Ireland Protocol. The protocol removes the risk of a hard border and secures Northern Ireland's access to the EU, but is likely to affect businesses' trade with GB, which I'm sure members will be familiar with. The agreement also includes a transition or implementation period, so the substantive change won't be seen by businesses until starting next year. UK government policy, as we understand, is not to extend the transition period, so that period will end in December 2020, which brings us on to Phase 2. Phase 2 significantly increases the range of issues that are brought into play. So in this period, UK government will be negotiating the implementation of the protocol and the operationalisation of those arrangements. They will be negotiating a future economic partnership with the EU, which covers the totality of UK-EU economic activity. And at the third key priority for UK government will be the development of its independent trade policy. So as an independent member, how the UK trades with third countries like the United States, for example, is frequently referenced. So the outcome of all of these negotiations put together will significantly affect how we approach our economic, investment, industrial, energy, environmental strategies across the piece. So we are seized of the importance that it's, again, essential that decision makers within those negotiations understand Northern Ireland's interests and priorities. So themes for the next phase that we consider, which we've shared with the committee, are 5 strategic work strands. First one, which is, as we consider the most important priority, is the negotiations on the implementation of the protocol and the operationalisation of these arrangements. The next one is the future economic partnership with the EU. Third one is an independent trade policy, so how Northern Ireland's interests are represented there. Fourth item is ensuring that businesses are prepared, can adjust to any changes, and the economy can transition into the post-Brexit economic conditions. And then finally, the fifth strategic area that we're looking at is the readiness of the department for the 1st of January next year. That's all from me at the moment. I'm sure we can come back to questions. I'll just hand over to Richard now for some of the energy.
Okay, thank you. Energy is a very complex area, and I think the overarching piece of energy is the development of a new energy strategy, which I hope I'll come back to very quickly. If I start by mentioning RHI, it's mentioned in the New Decade, New Approach document about the closure of RHI, and I think it might be useful if I spend a couple of minutes quickly to outline how we got here. The RHI was launched in 2012. The tariff was unconstrained, which really meant that the flaw in the tariff that you'll all be aware of was that the amount of incentive that we were paying was higher than the cost of producing the heat, and therefore a significant increase in the amount of heat over and above what was expected was produced. There were around and about 1,700 boilers on the non-domestic scheme that entered the scheme on that basis. And then in November 15, a new tariff was introduced for new participants. Around and about 300 to 400 participants came on under the tariff that had a tier and therefore reduced the incentive for people just to burn to earn money. The position we then found ourselves in leading up to the end of the last executive was that the first 1,700 to 1,800 participants were continuing to generate a lot more heat than expected, and the adverse to the budget that was available for the scheme was projected to be over the 20 years around and about £650 million. In the year leading up to the change in 2017, there were £26 million in excess of the AME budget that was available, that was drawn down from the block grant from other general taxation. So that was 1 year, and that was projected over the remaining life of the scheme to £650 million. So therefore, in February 17, the scheme was closed. In February 16, the scheme was closed, and then in April 17, we introduced 2017 regulations through the Assembly just before it shut down to actually put everybody onto the tiered tariff. And that meant that the promise that was made, the grandfathering promise that tariffs would only change by the rate of inflation, was breached. And that then was subject to legal action. We went through a judicial review of that, and in the December of 17, the court decided to dismiss the JR. That decision was then appealed by the participants, the Renewable Heat Association for Northern Ireland, and we continued then work on a long-term tariff. That long-term tariff, which was a piece of significant amount of work, was done by external consultants, led to the implementation of the 2019 regulations. It was an Act of Parliament, and that new longer-term tariff came into place in 2019. The amount of budget that's available for a renewable heat scheme is around and about £30 million as we speak at the moment, and the amount that we're actually using of that is about £5 or £6 million, because the tariff was reduced to bring it into line with the original intention of a rate of return of 12%. That then takes us to the present day, where we now have new litigation on the 2019 Act. That was due to be heard in the court before Christmas, but was adjourned until March this year to wait for the inquiry report to be published. So where we find ourselves is we have around and about 2,000 odd live participants on the scheme. We have a budget that is available for the development of renewable heat that is not being used, and that will then relate back to the energy strategy that we're developing, what might happen in the future. And we've been asked by the Minister in her first week to look at the proposals for the closure of the scheme and what that might look like. But it's important to emphasise that it's not an easy answer because of the potential risk of litigation, or the litigation that is ongoing, and any potential new litigation which ultimately will play back to the original grandfathering principle and the fact that the promise was made to keep the tariffs the same for 20 years, despite the fact that we then subsequently found out that they were flawed. So the future of renewable heat will all be part of the energy strategy, and the energy strategy needs to go into place to replace the current strategic energy framework, which runs out this year. That framework had really two key targets. One was on renewable heat, which clearly was not met, but the other was on renewable electricity, which is a success story. So we're now, as a region, leading the local area. We're in a better place than GB and a better place than the rest of Ireland. We have, as of the end of September, 45% of the electricity that is consumed is from renewable sources, and that is all, or the significant part of that is down to the Northern Ireland Renewable Obligation, which supported the investment in what was mainly a significant amount of wind capacity. To give members an idea on that, the amount of wind and solar capacity that has been installed since the NIRO was introduced in 2010 up until its closure is close to a peak day demand, and the peak day demand tends to happen in January whenever it's at its darkest. And that peak day demand, we're close to about 85 to 90% of that peak day demand can be met from renewable sources when the wind blows. But days like yesterday, when the wind doesn't blow, when we get rare days of high pressure and calm days, then we rely on the thermal plants, which, for example, at Kilroot is a coal plant, and the natural gas plants at Ballylumford and Kilkira. When we're in a position of the wind not blowing, then we are getting tight on the security of supply basis, and members should also be aware that for the last 15 years there has been a significant piece of important infrastructure, the North-South Interconnector, which has been in gestation and really needs to be delivered. So, for example, as an example, yesterday there was an amber alert, which really meant that with wind only being 15% on the system, there was an unexpected failure at one of the thermal plants, and therefore we were importing to capacity from Scotland, and Sony and EirGrid were working together to ensure we got as much electricity from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland. Now, in the end, that alert ultimately was ended without a need to shed any load. But members should be aware that there is that margin of supply which is tight in the absence of interconnection. So, as far as the finish, really, as far as my opening remarks, as far as the energy strategy goes, we issued a call for evidence in December. That call for evidence runs until the 20th of March. We have done extensive stakeholder engagement, including some members around the table here today. We will carry on doing stakeholder engagement. The call for evidence is structured in a way that hopefully allows it to be quite accessible. We're looking for information that we currently don't have, and evidence and numbers and to back the opinions that people have. Ultimately, this is all framed in the legislation, the UK legislation to deliver net zero carbon by 2050, which builds on the commitments made in the Paris Accord 2015. In order to get to full decarbonisation over the next 30 years, we've split it into the areas of power, heat and transport. Power, heat and transport emissions are about 2/3 of the total emissions for Northern Ireland in terms of greenhouse gases, and that plays into the wider climate change agenda. So we've got power, heat and transport. We've also got energy efficiency, because actually the best way to deal with climate change or to deal with reducing emissions is not to consume the energy in the first place. And the final element is on consumers, and I suppose to finish the remarks by saying that the key driver of the energy strategy will be, one, to maintain the hard-fought result, which is that we have some of the lowest electricity prices across the EU, and we don't want to lose that. We don't want to lose that for industry. We want to retain the competitiveness of our industry. And secondly, for domestic consumers, we want to make sure that as we transition to net zero carbon, it has to be done in a fair and just way, so that we tackle fuel poverty and we don't have people who cannot afford to heat and power their homes.
Okay, Chair. Well, I'll just finish off. 5 minutes just on my group. Okay. So I'm responsible for the management services and regulation group. Before I get into sort of the core responsibilities of what I do, I am separately responsible for Project Stratum, which I know is in your pack. That, of course, is the project to deliver ultra-fast broadband connectivity to areas of market failure, particularly in rural areas. I was asked by the previous Permanent Secretary when I moved into this department in 2018 to lead on that particular project. So I continue to do that and will do so until we award contracts just before the summer. But my colleague Dermot McLean, who is responsible for telecoms, will probably elaborate on that a little bit next week. So turning back to my core roles and responsibilities, I'm essentially responsible for the day-to-day operations of the department, with the objective of ensuring that ministerial policy objectives are delivered and the departmental accounting officers' obligations are delivered as effectively, efficiently as possible, and in line with high standards of corporate governance and accountability. I also am responsible for employment and regulations, which therefore includes oversight of bodies such as the Health and Safety Executive, the Labour Relations Agency and the Consumer Council. You will have seen the organisation chart, which I think is appended to the business plan. So I'm responsible for essentially 6 directorates in my group, covering finance, corporate services, and that includes human resource coordination, corporate governance, EU funds management, employment law and business regulation, and the insolvency service. So it's quite wide-ranging. The group's been in operation from the beginning of this financial year, and it was the construct of a fundamental reorganisation of the department, largely as a result of the issues that were addressed during the inquiry, which, amongst other things, indicated that there was a need to reinstitute a strong corporate centre. I suppose I was brought in to implement and do that and embed the reorganisation, as I have considerable experience in the whole area of corporate governance and accountability, finance and people management. So it goes without saying, of course, that the reputation and the credibility of the department has been severely called into question as a result of the inquiry. And the report will no doubt identify major failings in the areas of corporate governance and accountability. and therefore, as you can understand, morale among our staff was not high, and far below where we wanted to be. So it falls to the Permanent Secretary and largely myself, working in tandem with my colleagues, to restore reputation, both within and external to the civil service. So in order to do this, it's awfully clear that we're going to have to be better than everybody else and demonstrate that we are significant improvement in relation to issues around transparency, accountability, effectiveness, efficiency, and in relation to staff engagement. So a lot of work has already been done on this. We're not waiting for a report to come out. A lot of work has been done on this already, not least the fundamental reorganisation of the department. We have obviously now got a strong centre. We now have a dedicated energy group, which clearly was a criticism, a well-resourced energy group, and will become more resourced, hopefully, as we prioritise the resources at the beginning of the year. And in due course, Richard will no doubt get into the detail behind all of that. We've also strengthened our departmental board operating framework, created a lot of new specific committees dedicated to areas which receive criticism. In other words, resourcing and people, casework, which is a committee that looks at all of our expenditure decisions in detail, making recommendations to a Permanent Secretary and Minister, and also business plan and risk management. All of these are chaired by myself and are already working well. In terms of transparency and accountability, you have seen our business plan. I don't wish to comment on other departments, but I think we were the first department out with a plan published in sufficient detail, which clearly outlines what objectives are, how much money we have to spend, how we're going to do this, and how we're going to measure our performance. And I think we've already published our first update report, and we'll shortly publish our second update report. So it clearly indicates, the taxpayer, the ratepayer, what we are doing, why we were doing it, and what we hope to achieve by what we're doing. Of particular focus for me, of course, is staff. We have nearly 1,000 staff in the Department of Economy, and as I say, morale was not great, clearly. We have worked hard, however, to ensure that we're putting the right people, the right skills into the right jobs, an issue that was highlighted clearly in the RHI environment. We have brought in much needed commercial and industrial experience. Richard is an example of this on the energy side. His team is augmented by civil servants and specialists in the field. Equally, we've done that in relation to telecommunications. Staff that work to me in Project Stratum, led by telecommunications experts from industry. So we recognise the failings there and strengthened it accordingly. And as I say, I think we have significantly strengthened our corporate governance capacity and capability, and we've brought in people with appropriate experience and created a new directorate with specific responsibility for that. So lastly, we've been working hard to improve staff engagement levels, and we've made it a key business priority for the department. And I'm pleased to say that a lot of very detailed work has been done in this area, and despite ongoing issues around industrial relations and pay, etc., which are clearly you will hear about in due course, no doubt, I'm happy to say that as I understand from our latest civil service people survey results, which is just completed, the results haven't been issued yet, although I've seen some figures, this department has done particularly well and has improved against all benchmark targets, and we're scoring well above those across the civil service. This is important. It's important that we have our staff better engaged, better motivated, because that will ultimately reflect in better quality service to the customer. So we have lots of challenges ahead. I mean, I deal with finance. We have a situation every year with one-year budgets. We are constantly trying to live within our means, and up to this point have been relying on in-year allocations to manage our pressures. That is not going to change going forward. So we have obviously major issues to address on those things, and no doubt in due course you'll get a much more detailed brief in relation to our finances. So, Chair, that's just a very brief overview of three groups. That's helpful to you. Okay.
Yep. Thanks very much for all three of you, and I'm sure we will be wanting to get you back for more in-depth discussions on all of those areas. I have a list of speakers here, but I would just like to ask a couple of questions myself firstly. In terms of the initially the Brexit DFE stakeholder group. Could we potentially get a list of who the members of that stakeholder group, just for our information?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And you have outlined that the continuing preparation now for the phase 2 of this, and obviously there are a number of potential outcomes, and not least there is still the potential of reverting to WTO, and I assume the department is preparing for all of those potential outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the assumption that the withdrawal agreement goes through, the protocol will be operationalised on the 1st of January next year. So that will mean that the type of controls and paperwork that we were concerned about in a no-deal scenario coming into force at the land border won't apply. Those risks move to the east-west, so Northern Ireland's trade with GB. We're alive to them risks, and the Minister is seized on them. I listened to her this morning. It was the first point that she made is that Northern Ireland's trade with GB is critically important. It's our biggest market for both sales and purchases. The UK government's made a series of commitments, both in the recent New Decade, New Approach document, also on the floor of the House, and then through the general election campaign, specifically in relation to that NIGB trade flow. So I think our role now is to challenge UK government to explain how they see those commitments being delivered in practice in a way that they don't disrupt Northern Ireland's trade with GB. So in the eventuality of a, for example, as you referenced a specific scenario, in that if there is no trade deal at the end of next year, if that's the case, how do they maintain those commitments that they've made towards the Northern Ireland economy and Northern Ireland businesses?
Okay, and I just wanted to pick up on the RHI stuff with Richard, and the 2019 regulations had hardship built in and compensation. What is the protocol, or how is that going to be taken forward in the closing down of the scheme, or are we aware of that yet?
Yeah, as far as hardship is concerned, we appointed an external consultant back in the summer, and that consultant necessarily has been completely independent since that time of us. We facilitated his engagement with participants by actually writing out to all participants on his behalf, but the undertaking we've given is that all information that has been provided by the participants to him around the area of hardship, we do not have access to and will not see. He has made us aware that we can expect his report by the end of this month. In fact, as late as last week, he had a series of meetings across the country here with participants who had responded to the initial request for information. I imagine the likely outcome of that is that there will be instances of hardship, and what has been clearly out there in the open for some time is that people, whilst they invested in the new boiler, they may well at the same time have invested in more capital, if you like, to expand their business, with the expectation that the cash flow from the tariff would fund that debt. And so we would expect from our side in the department that his report will cover off these issues, in particular issues of hardship. The issue of hardship has to be played into this desire to close the scheme. And how that plays, that's what we, really since the text emerged the back end of the week before last, we start to look at the options for closure and what that might look like, and how things like the hardship and indeed the tariff review that we committed to at the time, and any change in tariff might well be argued to be due on the 1st of April this year, and that would require legislation. So, there's a lot of things in this tight window, if you like, that no doubt you'll want to discuss. It's not something we can put on the long finger, especially in the context of potential closure and what that might cost and what the risks might be. And I've mentioned the legal action that is ongoing in many areas. Everything we do in RHI has that spectre hanging over it.
Okay. And I'm sure that's something members will want to revisit further. I'm going to open up to other members. Sinead, really.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. And Colin, I just want to come to you first. I suppose for us as committee members here, we're all concerned about governance and transparency and oversight. And one of the key features of this committee is scrutiny. And we don't want to be found wanting either. So it's really important that transformation and major restructuring is embedded down. And once that happens, then I think, and I suppose, the morale of the employees will start to rise again when that's done. But I have absolute understanding that whenever you are restructuring an organisation like that, it is very, very difficult and people get very, very uncomfortable. But it is fundamental to the operation of this department that there is great scrutiny and transparency and governance and oversight. And I think that there's a lot of lessons that we've learned, but there's a lot more that we can do and learn. And I suppose we'll probably be regularly on top of that going forward. The other aspect that I would like to talk to Paul about as well, I mean, it's very difficult sometimes to plan for what you don't know, and that's really what you have been doing or been trying to do, or preempt for the past 3 years. And what I would like to ask, you know, Kiva mentioned about the stakeholder engagement and that you were regularly working with the business community. How often is regular? Is it a defined monthly meetings, or what kind of engagement are you operating in?
Yes, I think at two levels. So the formal stakeholder event largely kept to set pieces. So when there was a big event or our business community were engaging with key decision makers, we would organise a plenary session, and beneath that there were regular conversational meetings that would be much more regular, depending on particular interests that particular sectors may have found out and they want to talk about those in isolation. But we can provide you with a follow account of when it met, if that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. So it's not formalised meetings in any such, you know, it's just involving?
Try to do it as regularly as possible. Yeah. I can't recall the frequency at the moment, but we're more than happy to provide that. And as I said, I think that the key driver would, if there were larger events, so for example, if there were published text from the negotiations, we would bring the business communities in to provide our technical assessment of what the text said, or a large business delegation would be going to Brussels to inform Brussels decision making. If that were happening, we would offer a briefing session of what the key issues were and the evidence and analysis that we'd prepared that might help them in the room when they were speaking to either Whitehall or Brussels officials.
And are these meetings minuted?
No, I can't recall. No, I don't think they. I can check that.
Right. And then the other aspect of it, you know, obviously you're engaging with Whitehall or with the Brexit group within there. How open are they to listening to the protections required for Northern Ireland within the UK protocol, UK Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I think so.
Good working relationship, I'm asking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's been, so it's not just our department, this affects everybody. So across the NICS, with particular concentrations within us and agriculture, and then with the Executive Office being it's like the tip of that spear in engaging with it. So I think there's positive levels of engagement. I think our experience has been a willingness to bring us into the room and talk about it, and I think a recognition amongst Whitehall officials that they needed the evidence and analysis that we hold, they needed the lived experience, and through our engagements with the business community we were able to marshal case studies that were able to really illustrate what the problems were, and both officials here and in Whitehall knew that really landed with ministers. It enabled them to really visualise what the issues were, so we were bringing valuable products to them, so it's positive engagement.
Good. Okay, can I ask another question? It's Richard now. Richard, just when we were talking about renewables, and the good news story is about the wind and 45% of energy that comes from that. But you know, the renewable heat, it wasn't the actual scheme that was bad, it was how it was organised and structured. I mean, it's still a good renewable energy. It was just so poorly managed. So we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater in a way. So I'm just conscious of that. I think it's got such a bad reputation, but it's not the actual, renewable part of it. It was just how it was organised and how it was delivered. But I'm concerned about the volatility within our electricity supply in terms of the north-south interconnector. How many times do you feel that we are actually at risk there of the lights going out, so per se? You were saying that...
I mean, we're not per se, the last time that the lights went out a long time ago,
Yeah.
we're not at risk of the lights going out, but we have to take action. So the action, for example, eventually would be like organised load shedding or demand side management, as it would be known. So, but there is no doubt that the biggest issue around the north-south interconnector is that consumers in Northern Ireland are paying more for their electricity than they would have if there had been interconnection. Because effectively we've got not just an amount of wind through the Narrow up here, but there's a massive amount of wind in the Republic of Ireland, and the opportunity that the single electricity market provides for trading means that when we've got plenty of wind, we can be exporting electricity. That benefit will flow through to consumers, and vice versa. When we can be importing, if there was the interconnection, then we'd have lower prices. So it is actually, it's in the millions and millions of pounds each year that consumers up here are paying more than they needed to if we had better interconnection. And that unfortunately is it's less security of supply, although it is always a risk we are managing. It's actually the price that we pay for our electricity. And just to say briefly about the renewable heat side of things, the reality now is we do not measure how much heat we produce in this country, because actually the 68% of heat is still produced by heating oil, and we don't monitor the amount of heating oil because it's never been regulated. And that's one of the things we'll need to address through the new energy strategy. This is all about a pathway to zero carbon. It's about decarbonising heat. There is no silver bullet. There is no one-size-fits-all. Just last week, there was a celebration of the Gas to the West project, which was something that was supported by the last executive to the tune of 31 million. When, gas is now available in Derrylin at the glass plant there, for example. Who would have believed it 25 years ago when gas first arrived here? When people switch from kerosene, from heating oil, to natural gas, with the energy efficiency improvements of a modern boiler, they reduce their carbon footprint by 50%. That's good. It's on the pathway. It tackles fuel poverty. People can pay as you go. So that's great that people are getting a choice. The big issues that we have to address in the short term is not necessarily on the gas network, which could ultimately become a hydrogen network. It's actually in rural areas where we're saying, how do we, what about the electrification of heat? We have to switch off wind turbines whenever there's not the electricity demand, because there's not the opportunity to store the electricity that's produced. At the moment, the system can take up to 65% of the demand from wind at any one time, and Sony is working towards 75% later this year. But that means that at times when the wind's blowing, you'll see the wind turbines switched off. They're switched off because effectively the operator in Castlereagh House switches off operators in turn. So it's not good when you've invested in the capital for wind turbines to be switched off. So we're looking at ways, for example, of being able to use that electricity. And, we've got a real opportunity here through the development of the energy strategy to do innovative projects that look at both using more of the electricity that we could produce and tackling fuel poverty at the same time in rural areas by, for example, novel projects like maybe community heat networks and so on. So people have said to me over the years, and I was in the fuel poverty sector for a long time, that we can't tackle fuel poverty because of the volatility of fossil fuel prices. Well, actually, in the move to zero carbon, whilst it's going to cost money, there's a real opportunity that because the prices can be more stable, that we can really tackle fuel poverty for the first time. And that will be about joining up the community. And that's why it's not just an issue for the Department for the Economy, it's across the whole of government. We're working, for example, with communities, colleagues, about how to tackle fuel poverty.
And I suppose there are a number of significant commitments in the new decade, new approach document around climate change and moving towards a zero carbon economy. And I think we'll probably be looking to get a fuller briefing on all of that as well.
Okay.
Gary, next.
Thanks, Chair. That leads me on nicely just in terms of the New Decade, New Approach document. And I suppose my question is for Paul. It's around the Brexit stuff and the future relationship with the European Union and the commitments that the UK government have given within the document. It's to look at future access to the negotiations as we go forward. I suppose, could you maybe give us an idea as to, were there any areas where we were almost, in terms of Northern Ireland, not having a government for 3 years, where we were lacking access to some of the discussions directly with the EU? They state in the agreement that the Northern Ireland Executive are invited to be part of the UK delegation in any meetings going forward with the UK EU specialists or joint committees discussing Northern Ireland. Did we not have access during this past 3 years? Are these new things going forward?
So I think the challenge has not been about access, it's been about the restrictedness of what civil servants can do. So we were able to identify technical issues and explain how different scenarios might impact upon Northern Ireland. As officials without ministers, we were not able to set out a Northern Ireland position, and that's the difference now, in that with a minister in place, they can be involved in those political level discussions, and as an executive, they can agree what Northern Ireland's strategic priorities are in the executive. So that's the difference, I think.
Right. Okay, no, and that's fine. I think that's welcome, and I would agree with Sinead in terms of going forward. I think it is important that, and there's an onus on ourselves as well, to ensure that the stakeholders, the business community and civic society are kept on board with all of this stuff, and that their views are being articulated as well. On a separate matter, and it's in relation to, and I appreciate you may not be able to answer this, but the industrial strategy, and we talk about, and I'm just looking here in terms of the plan, it says that the draft strategy is likely to require considerable revision to reflect emerging economic policy priorities post-Brexit. There's talk of a review of that by March of this year. Will that be required to be consulted upon again once those changes have been made? How does that work?
So Dermot, who's coming to speak next week, is to provide you an update on the strategy. But you're absolutely right in that considerations of economic priorities have to price in how Brexit will impact on this place.
Yeah, well, we'll save that for next week. That's fair enough. And just finally, I just wanted to appreciate on the morale issue. I think it is important that as a committee we do reflect on the fact that officials have for 3 years been working away, if you like, in the background. I think it's important that as a committee we do what we can to ensure that those staff do feel valued, and I would appreciate if you do, I hope you don't mind saying, Chair, but if you do pass on our thanks to those people for a difficult job over this past 3 years.
Thank you. John, you're...
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I had to step out for a moment. So if some of the points I raised have already been covered, just say they've been covered, I'd catch up with them in the answer to the committee. But can I just add in terms of Gary's comments there, and Colin, you said at the start in terms of staff morale. During my period of time, either as Minister or sitting on committees or whatever it may be, I have found the vast majority of civil servants hardworking and dedicated and wanting to make changes, positive change in people's lives. If the RHI report identifies mistakes made by civil servants, and indeed politicians, those will have to be dealt with, but it certainly isn't a reflection of my experience of working with civil servants. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to give you a hard time in this committee, because that's part of my role, but I do think that's worth putting on and should be put on record. In relation to, Colin, you said at the start, the Department has a £1 billion budget inclusive of EU match funding. How much EU match funding does that involve? And just for the purposes, you may not be able to answer this, if we lose that, where is it replaced from?
The two major programmes that we have access to in the department are the European Regional Development Fund, ERDF, and the European Social Fund. Those are multi-year programmes stretching over a 10-year period. They're worth, over that length of period, £1 billion. So the annual drawdown is a relatively small amount of money. But it's essential because it drives an awful lot of our business development activity. and for many years we had difficulty in getting that expenditure to where it was basically needed. We suffered a lot of problems in relation to governance and compliance issues. I'm happy to say now that we would be an exemplar in relation to the spending of this money, to the extent now that I think that we're the only region within the British Isles and indeed perhaps across the European Union that are able to access performance reserves, money that were set aside. If you didn't achieve targets, we've been able to release all of that and spend it. So it's an essential thing for our offering to our business sector. If there will obviously be a lot of discussions in relation to the replacement. You will have heard comments about the Shared Prosperity Fund. The amount of engagement at official level between officials in Westminster and ourselves has been quite limited in relation to that, simply because officials in Westminster didn't have the ministerial cover to engage with the devolved administrations. That said, we will be making a fairly significant pitch to ensure that the amount of money that was previously drawn down under previous programmes will be matched going forward. Who's to say what the outcome of those negotiations would be? But I would simply say, in relation to what this department does and its offering, particularly on the business development side, it is absolutely vital to the SME and micro business sector that we do have access to investment broadly similar to what was in ERDF. At ESF, discussions are ongoing, John, and we'll stay very close. And clearly this will be a priority for our Minister now in place to ensure she talks to the necessary ministers within Whitehall.
It's on a slightly different subject, but thank you for that answer. It's just a question to Richard. In terms of, and this has been asked again, and the answer's been given, I'll check and answered, so just feel free to say it's been answered. In terms of RHIs, you outlined that, using my own words to interpret what you've said, that's not quite clear what is meant in the two governments' document around closing down the RHI scheme, because you have got contractual obligations to those claimants, around 2,000 claimants that are there. And I think you said you're currently using a budget of between 5 to 6 million from an overall budget of 30 million. Can you elaborate on that further? And even indeed in terms of the new energy strategy that you're bringing in, RHI, concerns raised that it wasn't renewable in the sense of carbon friendly or reducing carbon emissions, etc. Will you be conscious of that moving forward in terms of a new energy strategy, that renewable should also mean reducing our carbon footprint?
Of course, and the distinction here is that fossil fuels is the release of carbon dioxide that was captured millions of years ago, whereas biomass is short cycle carbon. So in effect the argument is that the amount of carbon dioxide absorbed in the growing of the wood is released when it's burned. And it's short cycle, so it happens over 1 to 3 to 5 to 10 year life cycle. And so that's why biomass is acceptable, has been defined acceptable globally as a renewable option. But for example, in GB, the RHI now, which still is running for another, well, it's due to finish in 2021, but may well be extended. It bans biomass in conurbations because of fuel or air quality issues, so particulates that come from the biomass. So your point about what is renewable and renewable definition is well made. We've been asked by the Minister as a matter of urgency to come up with what closure might look like, and we need, I mentioned when you were out, we need to do that quickly, because actually there are things coming down the track like hardship and tariff reviews that need to be addressed sooner rather than later. The long-term strategy is really important, that we come up with solutions that drive through renewable energy, because whilst we are a leader in renewable electricity, there has been a flight of capital. You know, people are investing elsewhere in another part of the island and across the water. They're not investing here that much anymore, and jobs have gone. So this plays into the economic development side of the department. So we do need to get on with it. It's really important that we get on with getting an energy strategy landed, so we have support for renewables and support for economic development along the energy line.
A very quick point, Chair. So, looking at it from a slightly different angle, do you now have a budget line with £24 million spare?
Well, in effect, who knows where things go with Treasury, but at the moment there is undrawn down support there for renewable energy that we're not utilising, that other parts...
Sorry, is that Treasury money or is that money in the black grant?
No, it's Treasury money.
Okay, right, okay.
So, see on that budget line that's there, does that disappear at the end of the financial year?
It's there for... I don't know the exact detail, but it doesn't disappear at the end of this year. No, definitely not. And at the moment, the equivalent schemes in GB are drawn down their share of the money, and we're not.
And on the science of the carbon neutrality of biomass, there are question marks over that now, and I think that's really important to reflect in the call for evidence and stuff as well.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentation this morning, and I certainly welcome the frank recognition that the Department has had internal problems in the past, and certainly that recognition is always a first step to finding solutions, so I wish you well in that transformational journey that you're going forward with. You have maybe answered part of my question that I proposed to ask. It's around security of supply. And I know in the last mandate, members of the Economy Committee and indeed members in the Assembly had major concerns around security of energy supply, and the talk was about the lights going out in 2023 or thereabouts. So I'm just wondering, has that threat now been fully removed in terms of the lights going out? And the interconnector, I wonder if maybe if you could give us a quick update just where that project sits at the moment, and I wonder if you could also explain if there are any complications presented through bringing energy through that project by Brexit. Has that made things any more complicated, or are there any implications? And just finally, maybe a big question, but you may not be able to answer today, but just in terms of the new decade document and the deal, has the Minister costed the departmental, the total commitment of your department towards delivering all the wish lists within that document?
I'll take your last point first, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think all departments that have commitments that are linked to them are now flying their way through the document just to confirm that they are relevant to their departments. And certainly as far as our department is concerned, the Minister has asked us to cost it over a 3-year period. I mean, there are many references, as you know, there's events, there is city deals, there's McGee, there's costing, the competitiveness of regional economy. Some are more easy to define, others are less easy to define. So there is always going to be a little bit of a range of costs here, I think. But if I can assure you, we are doing this work. I think it would be, however, remiss of me to say that as we sit at the present moment and look into our financial year 2021, we would assume, say, a flat cash allocation, which we were planning for. In any event, we have inescapable pressures of £31 million that we can't fund at the present moment. So we're going to have to deal with.
That's before you go into the wish list.
Before we going into. So anything over and above that would need to be new money. And just from my cursory glance at these things and some knowledge of the areas, this is going to be a sizable amount of money. So we are doing the exercise, and I suspect all departments at the present moment. These will probably feed into the discussions that ministers are having at these.
Yeah. Okay.
So a concise answer to your questions is we will never be able to say that the security of supply is absolute, because actually there's always a risk that because if you put in too much capacity, it costs too much. The interconnector is in planning, so that is with the Department for Infrastructure at the moment, and you'll be aware of the Buick case, and you'll be aware that it's gone back. It came out of court and it's gone back into planning. So we're hopeful that at some point soon there will be a new decision on the planning. And I think the final point to make is that we have secured capacity through the single electricity market. It was reformed after its first decade. It was reformed in October 18. That reform of the single electricity market means that trade across the interconnectors, like the Moyle interconnector to Scotland and the east-west interconnector from Dublin direction to Wales, happens efficiently now, and what I mean by that is that whenever costs are higher here, we get import of cheaper electricity through the interconnector and vice versa. So it works to the benefit of the consumer. And I think to try and put members' minds at ease, we have secured capacity through the single electricity market capacity auctions to ensure that we can keep the lights on over the coming years, but we do need the interconnector because it comes back to the fact that that will lead to lower cost of electricity, which we all aspire to for consumers.
And Brexit, has it any implications for supply?
Yeah, very final point. There's been fantastic support for the single electricity market between UK and Irish governments. There's a commitment even in the no-deal scenario, which hopefully now is gone for good, that we would retain the single electricity market. And there was a lot of good work done with both Whitehall and Dublin officials to ensure that in an EU exit scenario, the single electricity market will be retained for the benefit of consumers here and across the island.
Thank you.
Claire.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I suppose we're hearing an awful lot about New Decade, New Approach, and it almost feels like that's the programme for government for 2021-22 at this stage, because we only have 2 years left within this mandate to try and put forward any aims and objectives. I suppose the one thing that I'm not hearing in this mandate is the approach around outcomes-based accountability and how we are working with other departments to be more strategic and how we approach policy, so that indeed the savings that we must make over the next probably 10 years or more is around strategic thinking. And even just to draw to an example around RHI, it's not just about renewable energies. It was somewhat to supplement farmers and the agricultural economy. Are you having conversations with DERA to feed into that? Being probably the biggest economy in Northern Ireland, if we pull the rug from beneath that, then we cause all of ourselves great difficulty. So I suppose I'm quite keen to understand what engagement you are having with other departments, not just in relation to RHI, but indeed all the other priorities that you would have moving forward. I'm really keen, and maybe it's not appropriate to ask you to outline this today, to hear more about your restructuring exercise. I know you said it was in response to RHI, but again, I think all government departments need to be quite keen to look at how they can make efficiencies, and again, that will feed into their objectives and what their intent is and around that. So I would be really interested to know, and again, I'm happy for the officials to come back and present to us around that. What is your focus around that restructuring? Is it just about making efficiency? Is it about trimming the fat? Or is it around how do we better improve public services? How do we deliver for the people of Northern Ireland? Because I think sometimes in public services we tend to get focused on the bottom line, when really our focus should be about providing for the people of Northern Ireland. And I suppose really it's just to pick up on a point that John made and the Chair. The 25 million that seems to be underspent, I appreciate that it may not have to be spent by the end of this financial year, which I'm quite pleased about, given that we have very few months left. But do you have a date of when it does have to be spent? Because indeed the strategies that you're developing are not going to take 2 months, I would imagine. I imagine it's going to take a piece of work. So we need to have that in place. We need to have a forward work programme. We need to have aims and objectives, and we have to have an expenditure plan in order to spend that outstanding 25 million. So what I suppose am I really asking you, realistically, are we going to be sending that back to the Treasurer? Thank you.
Okay, number of points there I can deal with the first two. Sure. Okay, and your point about outcomes-based accountability. I think I'm glad that the civil service, in presumably agreement with ministers prior to the collapse of before, had already signed up to the principle of outcomes-based accountability. And as you're aware, we have an outcomes delivery plan, which during the last 3 years has been continually updated. The whole relevance of this depends upon interdependencies upon departments, so we have a focus on certain outcomes. That is working. If you actually look at the detail and look at the various measures and those people who are contributing to this, outcome owners, etc., you will see the inputs across the department. In due course, there may be budgets that are set on the basis of outcomes, as such, across departments. I think that's the next step. I'm fairly content, however, that is now how we and how the executive will want to demonstrate their effectiveness, but it is entirely dependent upon departments working in partnership together. You mentioned there, of course, we're working with them in many aspects. And indeed, if you think about the RHI, there was criticism that people were not talking to each other. It simply cannot work in this particular environment, particularly in an environment where we're under financial constraint and the need to justify the effectiveness of what we're doing, not in an output way, but in an outcome way. Even our own business plan, and we've gone sort of the extra mile, and if you do look at how we measure our performance, it's on an outcomes-based basis, and you'll have seen the list of how we are measuring our performance. That's the way we need to go, as the direction of travel, and I'm confident that would be the case and will be required to be done.
Chair, do you mind if I pursue that? And do you think, yes, that's the intention, and that's the, I suppose, the ideal position that we would like to find ourselves as a number of administrations. But how realistic is that going to happen within the last 2 years of this mandate? Like, I almost get a feeling that the last 2 years of this mandate will be.
You're talking about programme for government and those that sort of.
Yes, essentially, yeah.
But you know, as an official, I can't say to you here what the discussions will be at the executive table. The objective, and I think it's even referred to in the new decade year approach, is a multi-year programme for government and a multi-year budget. Absolutely, we need that. We simply cannot continue on this basis of one-year budgets where we're topping up in year 3 monitoring rounds. There's no way to manage anything. So there has to be a longer-term view on this. I think it'll be quite difficult for the executive, particularly as they try to get a handle around those issues within the document, to build into what we're doing in our core business today, augmented by that, because there will be tough decisions have to be made. So I can't give you an answer to that. I think the desire would be to do something around that. Whether that's achievable or not, that will be for the executive to decide.
Sorry.
I was just going on the restructuring. That's what you want to.
No, go ahead. No.
On the restructuring, I think you mentioned maybe I give the impression that it was entirely in relation to the RHI inquiry. Of course, it's linked to it. There are significant failings in governance and accountability that needed a complete structural relook at how the department was put together. There was a need for a strong corporate centre, a chief operating officer role to control the day-to-day operations, but it was also designed to make us more effective and efficient. Overly bureaucratic, not getting our services to the customer quickly enough. So it's driven by a need to generate more effective and efficiency, releasing resources to the front line, as well as fixing fundamental governance and accountability flaws. So it's a dual approach to all of this. It is a critical focus for the department. I may be leading on most of these things, but my colleagues are equally focused on these sorts of things. We do need to restore credibility in the department, and quickly, and bring our staff with us, and I think we're getting there. So on to Richard.
So very quickly, programme for government outcome to climate change, greenhouse gas emission reduction. That is led by DAERA, and DAERA have engaged other departments, and we continue to work in the last 3 years with DAERA on that. As part of the development of the energy strategy, we have established a formal government stakeholder group that has senior representatives from all departments. Even the departments you don't have legislative responsibility for energy, for example, health and justice, are the largest energy users. So all that, it is truly cross-government, and any new energy strategy will have to go to the executive, even though it's been led by the economy. And the final point is, I'm no public finance expert, but my understanding is that the AME is available in the year and then it's lost.
Do you mean in this year?
Yeah, and
so
then next year's underspend would be lost next year.
So at the end of this financial year, in a matter of months, that 24 million will be lost. So it goes back to the Treasury.
In the same way that the 26 million that had to be found a few years ago from the block grant has never been recovered from AME either.
Okay. But it's recurrent. It's recurrent at the minute, the AME.
Yeah, the AME budget this year, for example, is just as close to 30 million, and we're only spending 5 or 6 million of it, and the remainder is lost.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I have here the sort of key issues for consideration document for the first 3 months, and there's a couple of issues in it that I wanted to raise. One of those was the Presbyterian Mutual Society. Obviously, the department granted £25 million interest-free loan to PMS. There were reports about 18 months ago now, it would be, that loan is unlikely to be ever recouped. Is that still the position?
It is, the full amount of assistance that was given to GMS back in 2012 was in the region of £226 million, I do recall. And a lot of that was funded by the executive, some grant and treasury, and then £175 million loan funded by repayables. We're at a critical time in the process because we're coming to the end of the 10-year period, and that is the point in which all of the major investment properties will be realised and sold. We're halfway through realising all of those, and at this point in time, we believe that the £170 million loan will be repaid. Will be repaid. There may well be some slippage towards the end. It is entirely dependent upon the volatility in the property market. But I think if you were to look back then and where we are now, I think the achievement that we are now beginning to project is favourable, and so I think give the impression that the due diligence that was done then was particularly thorough. So we're hopeful that the £175 million loan will be repaid, if not in full, almost in full.
And in terms of the small savers that were sort of protected by the government intervention, have they all now been paid back?
You'll recall the structure of the deal at the time, and the decision that was taken by ministers was that the small savers would be almost paid in full, and that the larger savers would have to make a contribution. As far as I recall, the small savers were repaid almost entirely in full. They received almost all of their sums back. The larger savers that made a contribution to the bailout fund will not be repaid. They are an unsecured creditor.
Can I write to you about an individual who was a small saver and approached me about a week ago?
Yes, absolutely. We do receive correspondence from time.
She hasn't received.
Time.
I think she had £7,000 in this society, and she hasn't received anything.
Right. Okay. I'm surprised to hear that the small saver has not received response.
Okay.
Please write to me, write to the Department. Yes.
I will. Thank you. In terms of the Brexit processes, could I ask what assessment has been made of the cost of the economy if the Northern Ireland Protocol is imposed upon us?
So our assessment is that it's too early to tell. Because I mentioned, I think, during the presentation that the variables. While Northern Ireland's trade with the EU is secure, our trade with GB is still to be determined through the implementation of the protocol, decisions between the UK and the EU, and the outcome of the future economic partnership negotiations. So there are quite significant variables there, and the range is significant. So it's too early to provide a definitive assessment of what that impact will be. We are alive to the risks, that there are risks that need to be mitigated, and I mentioned that UK government has made a series of commitments about those particular issues, and it's now our priority to make sure that they deliver on those commitments to ensure that those risks don't materialise, and any range of economic impact is reduced to as minimal as possible, if not completely mitigated.
And in terms of just consumers and their access to products and their access to services and stuff like that, is there an assessment being made in terms of the impact there? Because one of my great concerns is that we're going to end up seeing more and more advertisements and stuff on television with, the wee hashtag at the bottom, product not available, or the wee star at the bottom, product not available in Northern Ireland, or offer doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. Have we made an assessment in terms of the sort of impact that the Northern Ireland Protocol would have in that regard? So
the scale of the issue is significant. So around 2/3 of what we buy comes from GB. Within that figure, again, around 2/3 is wholesale and retail, so these high street shops. So it's a significant issue that we're alive to. And again, when the Prime Minister was in Belfast, he made a statement about the only circumstances in which that risk would materialise would be if the free trade agreement, which they're aiming to negotiate, is suboptimal. So we need to hold them to that and explain that, because this isn't just an economy issue, and it's a good point that you've raised, that this affects businesses but also consumers and significantly in this space, because the large volume of products that are available on our high street that come from GB.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair, and welcome, gentlemen. And I think we all recognise the work that the Department has done to address a number of the issues, I suppose, following on from the RHI and inquiry and so on. I think we welcome that. You've obviously been reacting to it. Would you, Colin, would you recognise that there was major gaps within the department in relation to processes and procedures within the organisation? And do you recognise in your proposed changes terms such as the need for management review, internal audit and project management, indeed quality processes, something that certainly a number of us felt were lacking in the department? Certainly was not forthcoming in what we heard about how the department had been run. And do you recognise the need for review and the introduction of such process within the organisation?
Yeah, very much so. You have to realise, we're new to the department, but we are new to our
yes, right, fair enough. Yeah.
We're clearly very attuned to what went on. So we watched the inquiry unfold just as much as you did. I haven't had any party to the report, so I don't know what's in the report per se, but it's very clear from what has happened what the feelings were in the area of governance and accountability. All of the points that you raise, of course, I recognise. They would be fundamental to any assurance regime that a permanent secretary would wish to rely on to ensure regularity and probability of the use of public funds. That said, clearly there were deficiencies, and as what you've heard from my introductory remarks in relation to structure, we have certainly put in place the right structure to put a focus on corporate governance and accountability as being a primary objective of the department. We have a dedicated division in my group to do so. You mentioned project management. Of course, feelings there, we have strengthened that up. I think one of the major feelings was, of course, we didn't have the necessary perhaps industry and commercial expertise in relation to those. I mean, we're now running major capital programmes, for example, Project Stratum, where we now have the project director who's a telecom expert who's managed major programmes. And within my group, that's been taken forward and managed in an extremely professional way, subject to gateway review at various stages. Good. In the same way that Richard's side, on the energy side, Richard's background doing exactly the same. So there was clear, obvious lessons to be learned there. I mean, internal audit is a fundamental requirement of your assurance regime. You rely on a programme of work, a strategy and a plan which you devise to look at risks are over a cycle period. That's all embedded in the organisation. And I think we have brought in people who have an experience and background in this. I've worked in corporate governance and accountability most of my public sector career. I'm an accountant. I've done this sort of stuff. And so there's a focus on all of this. We recognise that if we don't get this right this time, the credibility of the department and the service is at stake here. So we've invested heavily in this to get this right, and we do not apologise for a good process. And we will be rigorous in the scrutiny of how funding is applied, ensuring not only regularity, probity, but also best value for. So you can be assured, and you will test us on this going forward, that at strategic level, I think we've got it right. We now need to work through to ensure that we don't have these sort of issues rising again, because
Good.
I can't give you any more assurance to that.
That's a good start. Thank you very much. Richard, a lot has been said about energy. One of the factors that's come up here over the years was the cost of energy in relation to business, especially relating to manufacturing costs. How do you feel that will be addressed or partially addressed through the new energy strategy?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that our energy costs today are very competitive across all comparators across the EU. Electricity and gas costs in Northern Ireland are cheaper than in GB, as an example. The economics would say why that should be the other way around. In reality, we've got a more efficient market, and we've got a very strong regulator in the utility regulator who provides the right degree of scrutiny and price controls of the monopolies that operate the assets here. There is a fundamental issue with larger industrial or larger business, and you know, you will hear people comment on that, and that is compared to large businesses in the Republic of Ireland. The decision was made some time back, and it was a political decision to allocate costs from business to domestic households. Now, that was a political decision. It's not necessarily a cost-reflective decision. It doesn't really necessarily reflect how much of the assets that the customers use. It was a political decision to allocate costs to allow to ensure or to lower costs for industry and increase costs for households. That's something up here over the years, and I was a non-exec director on the Utility Regulator Board for 8 years. It certainly wasn't in the mind at that time of the board to do the same up here. And you can understand why people would want it, but it would mean that if we were to do the same, then it would increase the costs of electricity and gas to domestic consumers, and we have the highest prevalence of fuel poverty across the islands, and we weren't of a mind to do that.
No, just bearing in mind places like Michelin, one of the big issues there was the cost of energy. Yeah. Obviously the processes we're using were high energy, and I suppose you're competing across Europe and indeed the world. That's our big problem.
You're right. It's a significant, and as we go forward in the energy strategy, we've got to be very cognizant of the relative competitiveness of industry. In other words, the moving to net zero carbon is not going to be cheap. It's going to cost, and so we have to ensure that all those costs are subject to the proper scrutiny to ensure that we don't make our competitive position any worse.
Great. Thanks very much, gentlemen. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, that's us in terms of questions. Just like to thank you all for that session. It has been really informative. And I think just to reiterate the points that have been made by John and Gordon and Gary in relation to the work of the department and officials, and notwithstanding that obviously there were failings and they're significant, but I think it's important in terms of not least building public confidence that we have on record the restructuring that has taken place and the focus that there is on corporate governance. So that is very welcome to have on record. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
See you soon.
Chair, there's a number of issues that were brought up during the various questions. We will capture those and put a request into the Department for information.
Sure. Paul had mentioned in response to one of the questions that he gave some information in relation to consumer spending habits, purchasing habits, which he seemed to have just off the top of his head. Could we get a more detailed briefing on that if possible?
Please.
No worries, yeah.
Okay, so we're moving on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're moving on then to item 17, which is the overview of secondary legislation. A number of statutory rules have been laid during the period of suspension, which are still within the statutory period for consideration by the committee. So, Peter, you want to?
Yeah, Chair, it's just as I'd flagged up before, several hundred statutory rules have been laid across all departments in the Assembly during the last 3 years, of which we have around 30. How a statutory rule works, especially if it's negative resolution, is that ultimately it gets laid and it comes into an effect on a particular date unless the committee decides to strike it down. A technical term is pray against it or annul it. The countdown only starts with plenary sittings, so we've had a number of those in the last couple of months, for various things. So on some of these statutory rules, we're down to about 4 plenaries left. So that means, as I said before, we are under time pressure, but it's not an absolute immediate today time pressure. So there's a number of the statutory rules we have here that we've clustered. Say, for example, where you've got the same rule being laid 17, 18 and 19, we've put them together. As members will appreciate, things that have already passed and happened would be very difficult to pray against and strike down. But what I'd also like to flag up is that what may occur during this process is processes within the department that members may want more information on. We've already had a couple of members have mentioned getting a bit more briefing on just exactly how student funding works, how the loans work, how that's paid, what's available to young people who study outside the region and so on. And I think that's something we'll now press for an early briefing on, because it's incredibly complicated. And those who remember back to the Dell committee when this first came in, when student fees first came in, it was an issue that caused a lot of questions and so on, simply because of the way the thing was managed. And it moved from a loans company that was set up to a different arrangement. I think it might just be useful to get some background on that. So we will make a beginning on these statutory rules. I'm conscious of the fact that we do need to probably vacate at one, because there'll be a changeover for the next committee, but we'll go as far as we can, and if we leave 5 minutes at the end, there's a couple of other items we need to address.
And just to reflect that, this was a significant number of pages for members to get through, and we do need to give appropriate levels of scrutiny to the legislation that is coming through the committee. And some of them, I think, we may look to get a wee bit more detail on in particular. So perhaps if we look at some of those ones that are for years already past, and try to deal with those first.
So if we follow the cluster, Chair, as it's set down, that should probably allow us to at least get a number sorted out in the time we have, but we'll come back to others, and if there's any we want to drop out, we can come back to those as well.
So there is the process for consideration, which is laid out on page 5 of your table pack. The Department has provided a table with a brief narrative on each of the statutory rules at page 183 of your pack. And the document also contains a link to the SL, which are outlined in the proposals in relation to each of the rules. There are 3 categories of statutory rules, which obviously is detailed in your pack. Statutory rules which are interrelated and have been grouped together by subject matter, subject to negative resolution. Rules subject to negative resolution which are standalone, and rules which are not subject to any procedure.
Chair, as I flagged up before, we will effectively treat those as though they were negative in terms of what we read into the record for those.
And just to remind members that, as was mentioned earlier on, the examiner of statutory rules has not yet reported on any of the rules. The members will be agreeing to the legislation subject to the examiner's report. Okay, so we're going to move first of all to the industrial training levy, which is item 18. The background information is provided by the Department in relation to this group of statutory rules at page 183 on point 18.1 in your packs. The statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2019 number 155, the industrial training levy construction industry order, is on page 192. That rule is subject to negative resolution. So
Chair, if it's useful for me to interject at this point, this is one we see every year. In fact, we've been seeing it through this committee and previously the Dell committee since 2007. Effectively what it does is it provides a mechanism whereby a levy can be set across employers where there's then a pool for training. It used to be done by the Construction Industry Training Board, which has morphed into something else. So it's one we're very familiar with.
Could I propose that the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2019 number 155, the Industrial Training Levy Construction Industry Order, Northern Ireland 2019, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report.
You need to say that. But you need to read it. If members are content to proceed, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So that the Committee for the Economy has considered 2019 number 155, the Industrial Training Levy Construction Industry Order Northern Ireland 2019, and recommends that it be annulled by the Assembly.
Agreed.
Oh, hang on, which one? You've read the annulled one.
Oh.
No, we don't want that one.
Oh,
sorry.
excuse
No,
me.
we don't want that one. We don't want that one. So for each there's an option. So we're going with the contempt one. So if you read that again.
Please ignore that.
We just annulled that, so we don't mean that.
So the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2019 number 155, the Industrial Training Levy Construction Industry Order Northern Ireland 2019, and has no objection to the rule subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report.
Great, that's one down.
Okay.
So they then moved to 18.2.
So we're then moving on to the 2018 one, which is on page 100 and 202. And again, subject to negative resolution. So if members are content
Members.
that the
Content?
Agreed.
Yep. If you read out that one there.
The Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2018 number 131, the Industrial Training Levy Construction Industry Order Northern Ireland 2018, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner's Statutory Rules Report.
Agreed.
17. So, Chair, the next one's the 17. Are members content to approve that as well? Because effectively it has been collected and spent a couple of years ago. So if you read that one.
That the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2017 number 105, the Industrial Training Levy Construction Industry Order Northern Ireland 2017, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner's Statutory Rules Report.
Perfect. And then more than two.
Okay, so then we're moving on to the SRs and student fees. And the background information is provided by the Department in relation to this group on page 183 and 184. The statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2019-102, the student fees amounts and education support, number 2, amendment regulations, Northern Ireland 2019 at page 222. That the rule is subject to negative resolution again, and if members are content then...
Yep, there are again 3 of these, members. So the student fees go up by a measurement of inflation each year. Again, this has been coming through since the Primary Act came in, I think, 2010. There are 3 here. This is the most recent. We're going to work backwards. So therefore, are members content to approve that?
Agreed.
Okay, so we go for the positive one, yes, if you read that in.
So that the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2019-102, the student fees amounts and education student support, number 2, amendment regulations, Northern Ireland 2019, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner's Statutory Rules Report.
And then, Chair, what we'll do is we'll go straight to the 2018, and if you read that one, if members are content.
That the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2018-105, the student fees amounts amendment regulations, Northern Ireland 2018, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner's Statutory Rules Report.
Yep. And then, Chair, that takes us to the 2017 one. Again, if members are content.
Agreed.
If you go that one.
So that the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2017-104, the student fees amounts amendment regulations, Northern Ireland 2017, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner's Statutory Rules Report.
The 20.
You see, just in relation to the item 20, the student support, does that include the maintenance grant? Because the maintenance grant has stayed at the same level for the past number of years and hasn't been increased with inflation.
I want to give you a definitive answer on that, but I can't off the top of my head.
It seems to consider the loans.
Yeah, it does, and
the loan
my
amount.
understanding would also have been the
It's just I couldn't find it.
do you know what, let's set those ones aside. If
Okay.
members are, we set those ones aside, because that is a point, and that wouldn't be a bad thing to get information on, actually.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. So if we miss 20, Chair, and go to 21.
Okay, this was one that also the early conciliation, and we may look, yeah.
So, Chair, again, we have a further new statutory rule around this, and what my recommendation, members, would be we set these ones aside as well until we have further information on what's currently happening. Not all of these are full going back into history, 1718. So I would be happier, just because members have raised some issues, that we defer those, come back to them with better explanations. Okay, thank you. 22.
So then this is in relation to the health and safety.
Yeah.
The background information provided by the Department in relation to this group of statutory rules is at page 186 and 87. The statutory rule and explanatory memorandum are in relation to SR 2019-205, the Employees' Liability Compulsory Insurance Amendment Regulations, Northern Ireland 2019, are at page 299, and this rule is subject to negative resolution. So members are content.
Basically, Chair, that's simply ensuring that the appropriate regulations are put in place so that that employers have appropriate liability insurance for any employees they have. If members are content.
Agreed.
If you want to
So
read
that the
one.
Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2019-205, the Employers' Liability Compulsory Insurance Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2019, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner's Statutory Rules Report.
Agreed, yeah.
Okay, so then 22.2, the statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2019-185, the Radiation Emergency Preparedness and Public Information Regulations Northern Ireland 2019 are at page 306.
Those are exactly as they sound. They literally are how emergency procedures would be enacted and how people would be informed if there was any kind of radiation leak or scare. As you will imagine, those are not regulations that generally have ever had to be used, but they are updated on an annual basis simply so that every new eventuality is encompassed if members are content.
Agreed.
And this rule is subject to negative resolution as well. So that the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2019-185, the Radiation Emergency Preparedness and Public Information Regulations Northern Ireland 2019, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner's Statutory Rules Report.
Agreed. Agreed, yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, so 22.3, the statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2019-111, the Carriage of Dangerous Goods Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2019, are page 317. Rule is also subject to negative resolution.
Chair, again, this does very much what it says on the tin. Obviously, as members will understand, we don't want people carrying dangerous goods and substances in an inappropriate and unregulated way, so this sets down the conditions for that. So if members are content.
Agreed, yeah.
That the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2019-111, the Carriage of Dangerous Goods Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2019, and has no objection to the rule subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules Report.
Excellent.
Agreed, yeah.
20.
So 22.4 then, the statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2017-90, the equipment and protective systems intended for use in potentially explosive atmospheres regulations Northern Ireland 2017 are page 336.
Chair, again, negative resolution, and it is exactly as it sounds. Members will appreciate it is very, very important to have appropriate systems and protections in places when you are dealing with explosive atmospheres or those that are potentially. So this is the 2017, so if members are content on that one, do you want to read
That
it
the
out?
Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2017-90, the equipment and protective systems intended for use in potentially explosive atmospheres Regulations Northern Ireland 2017, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules Report.
Excellent. And you'll be glad to hear that wasn't updated 18 or 19, so we now move on to 22.5.
Okay, the statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2017-156, the Health and Safety First Aid Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2017, are on page 437.
Again, Chair, exactly as it sounds.
And I think maybe something we might want to pick up with the Health and Safety Executive at some point is mental health
From them as
or
well.
mental first aid. So this rule is subject to negative resolution as well, that the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2017-156, the Health and Safety First Aid Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2017, and has no objection to the rule subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules Report.
Agreed.
Thank you. And 20.
22.6, the statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2017-229, the ionising radiations regulations Northern Ireland 2017, are at page 443.
Again, Chair, it very much is about exactly as it says. I am not an ionising radiation expert, so I won't attempt to pretend I am. If members are content.
That the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2017-229, the ionising radiations regulations Northern Ireland 2017, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner's Statutory Rules Report.
Excellent.
So we then have some SRs on energy. Background information is provided in relation to this group on page 188. The statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2019-1, the gas designation of pipelines order Northern Ireland 2019 is at page 597, again subject to negative resolution.
And Chair, I'm assuming members, most of whom have served on the council, understand the process of designation of pipelines, where effectively it's like an adoption system, where it becomes part of the system.
That the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2019 number 1, the gas designation of pipelines order Northern Ireland 2019, and has no objection to the rule subject to the examiner's statutory rules report.
Great.
So 23.2 then, the statutory rule and explanatory memorandum in relation to SR 2018-5, the offshore electricity development environmental impact assessment revocation regulations Northern Ireland 2018 are at page 601.
So, Chair, that was simply revoking the existing guidelines so that new guidelines can be put in place, if members are content.
So also subject to negative resolution that the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2018-5, the offshore electricity development environmental impact assessment revocation regulations Northern Ireland 2018, and has no objection to the rules subject to the examiner's statutory rules report.
So, Chair, if I suggest we leave the SRs there before we get on to the industrial tribunals, because that'll feed into some of the stuff we've deferred in the briefing we'll get. Chair, if I suggest we move to item 27, Chairperson's business.
Okay.
Good.
Page 26.
Okay, so earlier this week, myself and Sinead, as the Vice Chair, met with the new Minister, Diane Dodds. We discussed the Minister's priorities in the immediate term and had a bit of a discussion around issues that we as a committee might view as important. We will be hoping to get the Minister up in the next few weeks as well. Once we've all kind of had the opportunity to reflect on the breadth of the department. I'm not sure, Sinead, if there's anything you would wish to add at that point.
No, but it was a very positive, a very constructive meeting. We all need to work very hard together, and I think there's a great expectation out there within the public that this is a time for delivery, and that the departments have to work together and we can't work in silos. And I think that was a good first meeting, and we'll see how it progresses from there.
We're nearly Chair, if it's really helpful at all, I can give you the highlights of that meeting in terms of subjects. Brexit, tourism, links with departments and GB, higher and further education, pathways, careers, skills, all falling out of that. The 14 to 19 review, expansion of McGee campus, energy and all the issues and more that you heard about this morning. Peace Plus and how that will work. Various issues around engaging with stakeholders, particularly chambers of commerce and so on. So it was very, very wide-ranging. And as you say, Chair, if members are content, then we'll seek a further briefing from the Minister in the next couple of weeks as soon as her schedule allows.
Yep. Also, earlier last week, I had asked Peter as the clerk to seek an update on the issues about Flybe. Obviously it has since been resolved, but there is a briefing included in the pack.
Yeah, Chair, we got an update on that, and it looks, members will have seen the media, so it looks like there's some level of resolution, but it's probably one just to keep an eye on. Members will also be aware that 90% of flights in and out of City Airport are operated by Flybe, so it's got a massive role to play in regional connectivity. So if members are content, we'll keep a watching brief on that and bring further updates as things move on.
So moving on then to correspondence, which is item 28. It is on page 739 of your pack, and we have received, obviously, the item of correspondence that was referred to earlier in relation to an alleged failure by local universities to undertake a quality screening in the distribution of funding. The author was advised by the clerk that the committee cannot provide whistleblowing protections. That, as normal protocol, permission has been requested from the author to forward the correspondence to the NI Audit Office, the Public Accounts Committee, the Permanent Secretary of the Department for the Economy for a response.
If members are content, that's how we'll proceed.
And then we're moving on to any other business.
Chair, we've not received anything, but if members have any other business they want to raise? No? Okay.
And so our next meeting then will be in room 29 next Wednesday at 10 a.m.
Excellent.
So the meeting can now be adjourned.
We can turn